Hey guys, in today's video, I want to show you how to create a multi-step form in React using Formik. So to get started, let's head over to codesandbox.io and create a new sandbox. And we want to click on the React sandbox. Okay, so what we want to do is create a couple of forms that are eventually all going to merge to collect the data at one point and then make something like an API request. So what I want the data to look like is something like this. So I want to have 4 fields. So I want to have first name, I want last name. So these 2 fields I'm going to capture in one form, so in one of the steps. And then I also want email and password. So email and password I'm going to capture in the second step of the form. And then once we submit the second step, I want to actually make the API request. So the way that I'm going to handle this is that I'm going to have a wrapper component. So in this case, I'm just going to use app, but obviously if you're actually creating a project, you probably want to create a component like multi-step form or something like that. But in this case, I'm just going to use app, and app is going to control all of the logic that involves changing steps and collecting the data. Then what I'm going to have is components for each step of the form, and of course you can have as many steps as you want. So the purpose of a multi-step form is that often we have very large forms in our project, and that's not very user-friendly. So one of the ways to tackle that is to actually break it down into smaller steps. So what I'm going to do is create some state here. So I'm going to call it data. I'm going to say use state, and the default value is actually going to be this right here. So it's going to be all of the fields that I want with their empty values. So of course, if these are all strings, if you wanted something else, then like an integer, then put the 0 value for the integer or something like that. Then what I'm also going to do is create some state, which is going to keep track of what step we're on. So I'm going to call it current step and set current step. I'm going to default this to 0. The reason for that is we're actually going to use an array to decide which step of the form we're on, and array is the index 0. So let's just create one step for now. So I'm going to create a new component called step 1. Now, I don't recommend doing this all within the same file here, so I'm doing this all within app.js, but that's just so it's easy for you to see, so I'm not constantly swapping between the files. Of course, for you, I would recommend that each step is in its own file, so that way it's easier to maintain and manage. So we're going to be using Formik, so let's add Formik. And I'm also going to add in Yup for the validation, but we'll look at validation later on. So let's import a couple of things. So let's import Formik from Formik. Now I also want the form and field components from Formik as well. So I do have a separate video that goes through the basics of Formik. So I'm not going to go through Formik itself in this video. I'm just going to show you how to integrate it into a multi-step form. But I'll leave a link in the description to that video so you can learn the basics of Formik. So step 1 is going to be a Formik component. And of course, we have to return the function from this, the render function. And I'm going to call form here, so we don't have to handle the onSubmit. Once again, this is in my other video. And then I'm going to use field. Now, of course, I don't actually recommend using field. I recommend you create your own custom field component that then hooks into Formik. But just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to be using field for this video. And field just creates a input field with the name that we give it. So I'm going to call this first name. And it handles the things like the onChange and everything like that, so we don't have to handle it. So first name and last name. And I'm also going to add in some paragraph tags as labels. So first name, and then also the last name. And I'm also going to add in a button. I'm going to call this next. So this is from step 1, so it's going to go to the next step. I'm going to give this a type of submit, since once this is triggered, I want to trigger the onSubmit on the Formik component, but we'll look into that in a little bit. So now we have this simple form. I'm just going to repeat it for step 2. Now you can have as many steps as you want, and I'll show you guys how to add in more steps later on. So this is going to capture the email and the password. Okay, so we've changed the names for those fields as well. And I'm also going to change this from next to submit, since this is going to be our last step. And I'm also going to add in a back button, which is actually going to be of type button. And I'll show you guys why we're doing it like this later on. So now we have these two simple empty forms. What I'm going to do is actually show you how we're going to render these forms. So I'm going to create a constant called steps, which is going to be an array, and this is going to contain every step within our project, within our multi-step form. So I'm going to say the first step is step 1, so the step 1 component, and the second step is the step 2 component. Okay, so now that we have these two, let's actually render this. So the way that I'm going to handle it is I'm going to say steps, but this is just an array, so we want to actually show, so you can see it's showing everything, but I actually just want to show only the current step that we're on. So since it's 0 by default, it's going to select this. I want to select this step 1, so I'm going to use current step here, and now you can see it's only showing the first step. Now I want to pass down some props to the step so that they can actually interact, and when we click next, they can actually go to the next step. So I'm going to create a function called handle next step. And what I want this function to do is provide me with the new data. So the data that was captured in that step, for example, for our step 1, I want it, and then the user input some data. I want to capture that data, put it into new data. And then of course I also want to, so let's do that. So it's set data. This is going to be an object. I'm going to spread in the previous state. And then I'm also going to spread in the new data. And then the other thing we want to do is increment the current step. So set current step. We're going to grab the previous current step and just add 1 to that. Okay, so that's our handle next step function. Now another function I want to create is handle previous step. So when we want to go back 1. So we're still going to expect new data, and the reason I still want new data is, let's say we've completed step 1 and then we're on step 2 and we fill out some of the data, but then we decide to go back. I still want to hold onto that data that they filled in, even if it's incomplete, so that eventually when they do return to step 2, some of the data they already inputted is still there, and they can just continue from where they left off. The only thing I'm going to change about this is, instead of incrementing the current step, I'm going to decrement it. Okay, so now that we have these two functions, let's actually pass these down to the steps. So the way I'm going to do that is as props. So I'm going to say next is going to be handle next step. I'm also going to pass down data. And the reason I'm passing down data is, let's say they go to step 2 and then they return back. I want the forms to be pre-filled with the data that was previously inputted. And since we're collecting all of that data here at all times, then Formik will just put that into the fields, and I'll show you guys that in just a moment. I'm not going to provide the step 1 with prev, since there's no previous step. So let's do this, and I am going to provide this one with prev, which is going to be handle previous step. Okay, so now that we have passed down some of the props, let's actually look at adding in some logic. So for step 1, I'm going to provide the initial values, and we should also grab props. I'm going to provide the initial values as props.data. So once again, this is props. So this is this data prop that we're passing down, which is our all of our data all collected into one place. So we're passing that down. We'll look into validation later on. And the other thing I want to handle is the handle submit, the on submit. So I'm going to create a function called handle submit. And we get the values and some helpers from Formik. Now I'm not actually going to be using helpers, so I'm just going to remove that and only keep the values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call props.next. So remember, this is this function right here. So this next prop, and what we're going to do is pass down the values. So when we call this, so when the handle submit is, so when this next button is clicked, it's going to trigger the on submit, which is going to call handle submit. we're going to get the values that the user inputted, and we're going to pass that to next. So when we pass it to next, it's going to go to this handle next step function. That new data is going to be these values. Since that new data is that values, we're going to set that to the data that we have where we collect all the data. And we're also going to increment the current step so that what should render next, so that this will go from 0 to 1, and then we should render step 2. So if we now test that out, if we say John Doe for our first name and last name, then when we click next, you can see it went to the next page. So let's also add in a console log for our data. So now if we clear this, let's refresh the browser. We say John Doe, we hit next, and you can see in data now we have first name John, last name Doe, and email and password is still empty. Okay, so now we have that working, and if we actually test it for this as well, we haven't actually filled out step 2, so let's work on adding in the logic for step 2. So it's going to be very similar. I'm going to copy the handle submit, I'm going to grab props, and say the initial values is once again props.data, and the onSubmit is still handle submit. So basically the same as step 1. Now we'll look into the back button, and before we do that, let's actually just test that this is working. So here we haven't got any validation, so it's just freely moving on to the next step. But if I put test here and test here, you can see that we also need to protect it from going to the final, to a step that doesn't exist. So we'll look into that as well. But before we do that, we can see here we have email and password here as well. So that's nice. So all the fields are indeed being captured. Now I'm going to add in one more flag to handle next step, which is going to be the whether it's the final step. So I'm just going to say final and default that to false. And then here, I'm going to say if final, then what I actually want to do is make my API request. So make request. I'm just going to, for now, console log form submitted. And let's say form data. So this is in place for an actual API request. So I'm going to call that function make request, and I'm going to provide new data. So new data here will actually be all of the data. And then one more thing we can do is just return. And the reason I'm returning here is because if this is the final step, I don't want to increment the current step by 1, since we shouldn't have any other steps remaining. So then what I'm going to do is in step 2, I'm going to add in true here. So the reason I'm adding in true is because this is going to be the value for final. I don't have to do this for next because I've set a default of false. So that should normally just always ignore this and instead just increment it by 1. So now if we refresh our browser, if we test this out and we hit submit, you can see it's not going to the next step. And if I add in some data, you can see here form submitted. So this make request function was actually called. So if you are making a real API request, you would have all the data here in form data. Okay, so now let's look into adding in the back button. So the reason I labeled this as type button is because normally on submit, it's not going to call this on submit function unless the form is valid. And if you have any kind of validation, then and the form is only partially filled in, and you would call this on back, then you would run into the issue of forcing the user to actually fill out that form so that this on submit is actually called. So instead, what I'm going to do is add in a on click, and this on click is going to be an anonymous function, which is going to go props dot I think I called it prev. Let me just check. Yep, so there's previous function here. And once again, we need to add in new data. So previously we were getting new data from here, these values that Formik provides us. We also get those values from the render function here. So here I'm destructuring them, but of course you could also do something like Formik props, form props, and do something like so prev, and then form props dot value values. But I'm just going to instead destructure it as values. So I don't need to call that. I can just pass values. So when this button is clicked, the values, so the current values for email and password, will be passed up to here, to this function here, handle previous step, which is going to take those values, once again put it into data, which is where we're collecting all of our data, and it's also going to decrement the current step. So if we test that out now and I click back, you can see it goes back to the previous step. You can also see that the previous values we had, John Doe, are still here. And the reason that those are still here is because in step 1, you can see we have set initial values to props.data and we're passing down data. So that's the reason why we're able to keep the values through each step. Okay, so now as a final step, I'm just going to do is add in some validation. So I'm going to import everything as yup from yup. And I'm going to create a new schema. So I'm going to call it step 1 validation schema. There's going to be a yup.object. And we just want to write some validation for first name. So there's going to be a string. It's going to be required as well. And then I'm going to do the same thing for last name. One more thing I'm going to add into the steps. So first is actually provide that validation schema. So validation schema is equal to step 1 validation schema. But to actually show the error messages, you can access them from the Formik props here. I think it's Formik props dot errors, and then you can check if that field exists. But I'm just going to use this helper component that Formik provides called error message. So you just import that from Formik. And the way that this works, you just provide the name. So this can be first name, and it's going to check for you. If first name has an error, then it's just going to render it on the screen. So I'm going to do the same thing for everything. So first name, last name, and I'm going to do the same for form 2. Email, and all you do is just provide the name. And I'm going to do the same thing for password. Now, of course, once again, I recommend you actually create your own custom Formik component, your own custom input component that hooks into Formik, which I cover in in another video. So now if I actually try this out, we can remove this. If I go back to here and I clear these fields, you can see that it says first name is a required field. You might also notice that the way that first name is written, it's got this underscore. That's because first name here has an underscore. If you want it to look a little bit more user-friendly, you can just add in .label, and then you can use that. So if I do it like this, last name, and then I hit next, you can see now labels are a bit more user-friendly. So let's copy that and do the same thing for step 2. And we want email and password. I'm just going to call this password and email. And on email, I'm just going to add in the validation that it should be an email. Then we have to remember to add this into the validation schema. So then if we actually fill this out and then we hit submit here, you can see this one will return error. And if I have this as nothing and I hit submit, you can see password is a required field. So if we wanted to add in more steps, all we'd have to do is just create another component like this. We would pass down the next, the previous, and the data. It would be very similar to step 2, where it would have the submit button and the back button. The only step that wouldn't have the back button, that shouldn't have the back button really, is the first step, since there's no previous one. And then everything else is basically the same. You have your validation schema for it, you always provide in the data, and you always add in the handle submit. And another difference is that the handle submit should only have a second parameter of true for the final step. Apart from that, everything else is the same. Now, before I finish off the video, I do just want to explain how you could handle tackling error messages from the API. So sometimes when you make the API request, you might get some sort of error message. This could be a generic one like server error, or it could be more specific to an individual field like emails already taken. So one way that you could handle that, and there are quite a few, is you could just create some state errors, set errors, and you could hold the errors in the object here, and you can just provide these errors to all your steps. And then within the step, you can check if, let's say, error.firstname exists, then you can just show that error message. And also, if you know that first name's on the first page, you can set the current step manually to the 0 index, so the first page. So that's one way of handling it. You could also handle it in a slightly more complex way, which is using format graphs, but that's something it's a bit more complex, and I don't think it's completely necessary. But yeah, so that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it's clearer now how to make multi-step forms in React using Formik. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like. And I do have a video covering Formik by itself, so I recommend you check out that video if you're not too familiar with Formik. And I also recommend you, if you're looking to learn more about React, and check out my channel. I have quite a few React videos. But yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.